Good morning, and thank you all for joining us. Welcome to the 2021 Columbia University Global Energy Summit. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm the co-founding dean of the Columbia Climate School, director of the Center on Global Energy Policy, and a professor of practice at Columbia SIPA. We come together virtually this year. I look forward to seeing all of you here in New York City next spring in 2022 for this annual event. Our Global Energy Summit last April had to be canceled on short notice as much of the world went into lockdown. And since then, this past year has been one like any most of us have seen before, with significant impacts, including on the energy sector and the outlook for climate change and climate action. A global pandemic, of course, that has inflicted so much suffering and continues to do so in many parts of the world. For energy, the lockdowns sent oil prices into one of their steepest crashes in history, and it spurred some countries to invest in economic recovery, including in some cases meaningful investments in clean energy. Here in the US, the murder of George Floyd laid bare issues of race, equity, and injustice that have also become increasingly central to the discussion of climate change. And also here in the United States, the election of President Biden has elevated the issue of climate change to a top national priority. It's a priority here at Columbia University as well, which announced it was making a historic commitment to tackling climate change by creating a new climate school, which I'm honored President Bollinger has asked me to help lead. Our extraordinary students this year learned and overcame, and their enthusiasm and optimism for the future sustained all of us who were lucky enough to work with them through this difficult year. Around the world, there's a growing sense of urgency to curb climate change and cope with the impacts we are already seeing and will continue to see. More and more companies pledging to be net zero by 2050, more and more countries increasing their ambition for climate action. And yet at the same time, there remains a stark gap still between ambition and reality. Emissions are going up, not down. And remember, what matters is not annual flow, but the total stock that accumulates. Coal demand this year, just for example, will rise 60% more than all renewable energy combined, taking coal back to its peak level of 2014. And while it was encouraging to see so many nations pledge to cut emissions at last month's Climate Leaders Summit, many other nations still have relatively little emissions per capita and will be growing their economies and energy use quite rapidly in the years to come. And there's another stark gap, the gap between the availability of energy services in a number of developing countries and the needs that those countries have if they're to lift their populations out of poverty. Confronting that hard reality of how to reconcile the outlook for rising energy use with the urgency of getting to net zero is a key theme for this year's Global Energy Summit. And we're going to hear public and private sector leaders talk about that and more from Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, South Asia, North America, and Europe. To kick off this year's Columbia Energy Summit, I'm really grateful that my friend and mentor, Dan Yergin, is with us today to moderate our first session with our keynote speaker, the Vice President of Nigeria, His Excellency, Professor Oluyemi Osinbajo. Dan Yergin, of course, needs no introduction to a global audience of energy leaders and experts. He is Vice Chairman of IHS Markit, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of the extraordinary book, The Prize, and author most recently of another fantastic book, The New Map. We're lucky to have him serve on our advisory board here at the Center on Global Energy Policy, and I am lucky to have learned so much from him over the years. Dan, thank you again for being with us at this annual event, and let me turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you for that, for your kind words. It's great to be part of, once again, the Center's Energy Summit. This is the 7th summit, and over the years, the Center has really established itself as a global center for energy, for climate, for policy, and it's different to do it this way, virtually, but it's great to bring it together and to bring a global audience together and congratulate you and everybody at the Center for the tremendous work that you've done over this last year under very different circumstances and the big contribution the Center continues to make. It is a global center, and so it's an honor, really, on behalf of the Center and all of us, to welcome His Excellency Professor Oluyemi Osinbajo, who is the Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. He's a distinguished lawyer, a very distinguished law professor and author. He was Attorney General of the Lagos State, where he was very well known for the many reforms he instituted. And since 2015, he's been Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria with President Buhari as president, and re-elected and now in his second term. Among his many responsibilities, he is chairman of the Economic Sustainability Committee that was established to deal with COVID, its aftermath, its impact on the economy. Vice President Osinbajo, a very warm welcome to you. I know you have some introductory remarks to set the stage, and then we'll have a discussion. Look forward to hearing from you. And again, very glad you're with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you. And Professor Jason Bordoff, Ms. Damilola Okunbi, and all our friends and colleagues participating in this seminar. Thank you for the opportunity to join in this very important conversation about global perspectives on the energy transition. The term energy transition itself is a curious one. It has multiple aspects, and depending on the context, we sometimes tend to focus on one element of the transition. But in fact, the transition itself is multidimensional. It includes energy consumption and access, energy fuels and sources, energy infrastructure, energy financing, as well as energy applications, and of course, the social and economic elements that are linked with energy. I will, one way or the other, touch on these elements as I hopefully bring to the fore the perspective from a growing economy, the Nigerian economy, that is still energy poor from an electrification and clean energy perspective, but energy rich in fuels and natural resources, as well as in innovating to deliver affordable and reliable energy for its very huge populace. But let me begin, if I may, with my conclusion. And it is that the global energy transition must be inclusive, it must be equitable, and it must be just. Taking into account the different realities of various economies and accommodating various pathways to net zero by 2050. Now, this point is important for two reasons. The first is that a just energy transition for developing economies is central to the right to sustainable development and poverty eradication. And this is enshrined in relevant global treaties, including the Paris Agreements. Second is that globally, we are seeing wealthier nations and development finance institutions banning all public investments in fossil fuels, including natural gas. Examples include the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Denmark, to name a few, as well as specific institutions such as the Swede Fund from Sweden, CDC from the UK, the European Investment Bank, and the Investment Fund for Developing Countries from Denmark. Other institutions recognize the importance of breaking fossil fuels down into the different fuels and assessing the role of each within the context of a just transition. But they're also facing increasing pressures from others to completely end all fossil investments, including investments in natural gas. One example is the African Development Bank, which has an inclusive energy sector policy aiming to support the optimal use of oil and gas resources to secure equitable benefits and increase energy security, but is increasingly unable to close any large natural gas deals in the face of external pressures. My view is that this approach does not appear to sufficiently take into account the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and leaving no one behind that are enshrined into the global treaties around sustainable development and climate action. So I think the questions, and I'll pose three questions. The first is, what would equity look like in the transition? Or what is the case for equity? And in answering this question, I've drawn from some of the excellent work of the Energy for Growth Hub on transition in Africa. And, I will, use quite a few of their statistics here. Excluding South Africa, the remaining 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa are serviced by a power generating capacity of just 81 gigawatts. And they've contributed less than 1% of cumulative CO2 emissions. Most countries on the African continent are low-emission, energy-poor countries with per capita emissions of between 0.8 to 1 ton of CO2, and that's for sub-Saharan Africa, and an average of under 2 tons per capita if South Africa and Northern African countries are included. So even tripling electricity consumption in these countries, barring South Africa, solely through natural gas would add just 0.6% to global emissions. By comparison, the United States emission stands at 15.5 tons per capita, while on average, Europe has per capita emissions of 6.5 tons. It's also, I think, worthwhile to remember that countries including the US, China, Japan, and other large parts of Asia and the EU include gas as major pillars of their multi-decade decarbonization strategies, including actively developing African gas in countries like Mozambique, Ghana, Senegal, and Nigeria for export to Asia and Europe, while limiting financing for gas projects for domestic use in those same countries. So I think limiting the development of gas projects poses dire challenges for African nations while making an insignificant dent in global emissions. So the second question is, what is the case for justice and fairness? I think that what is often not sufficiently considered in thinking through transition to net zero emissions is the critical role that energy, in our case, gas, plays in catalyzing economic development and supporting people's health and livelihoods, especially in poorer countries. Natural gas is currently used, of course, aside from power generation, for industry, fertilizer, manufacturing, and cooking, which are more difficult to transition than power generation. And also the role of transition fuels in delivering domestic value and in accelerating the pace of adoption of cleaner fuels. In Nigeria, for instance, there is a transition underway to shift from petroleum motor spirit or petrol to natural gas, which we believe is the economically sensible transition pathway and the bridge to utility-scale renewable energy. Similarly, liquefied gas, LPG, is already replacing the huge amounts of hazardous charcoal and kerosene cook stoves that are most widely used for cooking, while saving millions of lives lost to indoor air pollution annually. If in the midst of this transition, the financing of gas projects, including the use of LPG and CNG for cooking and transport, is constrained, then it will certainly set back the progress planned and may lock our financially constrained nations into higher carbon infrastructure. For most sub-Saharan countries, the conversion from gas to renewable energy for electricity generation is often hampered by weak or limited grid systems. This means considerable difficulties in integrating intermittent energy sources, solar, wind, above 15% of generation. But even enabled by a similar share of natural gas, intermittent renewables increase to over 30% of generation. So this reflects a roughly 2-to-1 ratio of dispatchable gas, enabling intermittent renewable energy sources. Also, in making energy choices to comply with net zero by 2050, I think it might be useful to note that the average expected operating life for a combined cycle gas plant is between 25 to 30 years, meaning that a new plant that is built today will likely operate until 2046, which still enables a transition away from more polluting fuels and the integration of more renewables. So what will inclusivity and support mean in the transition? I think the principle of leaving no one behind must translate into action by mobilizing international public and private capital that flows into countries that need it most. Our efforts aimed at delivering climate action while leaving no one behind must facilitate the flow of capital for renewables rather than limiting capital flows to gas projects. So there's currently a dramatic mismatch, in my view, in energy investments. So while representing just 15% of the world's population, high-income countries received 40% of global energy investments, at least in 2018. Conversely, developing countries with 40% of the world's population received just 15% of global energy investments. So energy consumption in developing countries has doubled in the last 15 years and is expected to grow another 30% in the next 15 years. Making capital available to fulfill the growing energy demand in these regions of the world is central to reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I think that LPG-based policies and programs are critical to realizing universal access to clean cooking solutions by 2030. And this will give 2.8 billion access to clean cooking solutions for the first time, and will need global investments of about 4.4 billion US dollars annually till 2030. Nigeria and countries across Africa are committed, as I think is obvious, to a net zero future, especially given their vulnerability to the adverse effects of climate change. And all have expressed commitment to their national development contributions under the Paris Agreements. However, I think much greater support in developing and implementing robust energy transition plans is needed. Clearly, the continent will require an unprecedented scale of investments. An energy mix that is compatible with the 1.5 degrees centigrade pathway would require something in the order of about 40 billion US dollars to flow into sub-Saharan Africa annually, a fourfold increase compared to the 10 billion US dollars invested in 2018. Further, the energy access element of the energy transition must be linked with the emission reduction aspect. I think for too long, we've considered these to be parallel tracks. However, pathways to reaching net zero by 2050 have to include first ending energy poverty by 2030. If energy access issues are left unaddressed, we'll continue to see growing energy demand being addressed with high polluting and deforesting fuels such as diesel, kerosene, and firewood. And as a result, efforts aimed to advance climate goals must first and foremost create carbon space for growing economies that have historically made negligible contributions to global emissions and have an obligation to their people to provide access to energy for electricity, for cooking, and productive uses. I think I'll stop here because I'm sure I'm already at about 10 minutes, and hopefully I'll be able to add a few more things during the questions. So I'll yield to you, Dan, for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice President Osinbajo. You have your very compact remarks. You have some very powerful messages. As everybody at this conference knows, you cannot go anywhere in the world and not run into the term energy transition. And I was struck by your remark where you described it as a curious term. And I wanted to ask you to expand on that, because I think what you've said is that equity needs to be part of the discussion of energy transition as well, that indeed it has different meanings, that there are energy transitions rather than a single energy transition. Why do you think that the concerns of countries like Nigeria and the needs that you have are not part of the general discussion of energy transition as we head to the Glasgow conference in November?
Thank you very much, Dan. I think that really, and this, I hope is one of the outcomes that this conversation will bring to the fore. The truth is that energy access is probably as crucial, especially for developing countries, as any other aspect of the transition. And I think that the point really has to be made and repeated that a fundamental problem for developing countries is energy poverty, energy access, and which is why a lot of dirty fuel and some of the problems that we're experiencing with energy use in Africa appear to just be escalating. And I think that if we don't address access to energy with a growing population, I mean, obviously Africa has the fastest growing population, and with the increasing demands for cooking fuels, for example, we're going to find ourselves, actually going in the reverse as opposed to making progress. Which is why I think in the conversation, a lot more attention needs to be paid to issues of energy consumption and access, and how what sort of transition fuels will be adequate or will be useful, especially in the context of developing countries.
So I think the fact that you're having to raise these issues suggests that, as you see it, the needs of developing countries like Nigeria are not being heard in the global discussion. Why do you think that is?
I think, frankly, I think voices of wealthier nations are obviously better heard, more frequently heard in global discussions. I mean, that's just the power configuration in the world. It's just a global power configuration. And perhaps also it might be fair to say that those views have not been represented as forcefully as they ought to. Perhaps we should say that there is a need for African countries to more articulately present these positions, especially at the various global forums where these sorts of issues are discussed. I think there's a need to clearly articulate these concerns, and it's possible that with maybe clearer articulation, with more emphasis being placed on these sorts of issues, we might be able to get a better hearing than we're getting at the moment.
Well, one particular point that you really emphasized, indeed I would say that you raised an alarm about, is the shutting off of capital for investment in energy infrastructure. One hears about major pipeline projects in Africa that simply international financial institutions and banks have said they will not finance, which has an impact on the revenues of countries and on the well-being of countries. How do you see this issue of access to capital? It seems to be something that quite concerns you.
Yes, I think it's really fundamental to anything that would resemble a just transition, especially for developing countries and gas-rich countries in particular. I think we need to accept that gas really is possibly the most sensible transition fuel that we can find. And clearly, it's that notion that gas is an acceptable transition fuel is one that appears to be acceptable to several countries. As I pointed out, a lot of the countries today that and I've given a few examples, the US, China, Japan, the EU countries, all have in their decarbonization strategies, they all have gas investments in their decarbonization strategy. So it's a bit strange to find that those same that those same countries may argue that the domestic use of gas resources in developing countries should be defunded. So I think I can't see, frankly, a way out, especially for cleaner fuels, for cooking, for example, which is one of the most widespread uses of fuel in developing countries. What is the alternative to that? I mean, we're transiting away from kerosene and from charcoal, which are obviously, pollutants and deforesting fuels. In order to do so, gas is obviously the logical and sensible cleaner fuel that can be used for transition purposes. And I think that this is the sort of thing that will be accepted. I think that a few countries and a few institutions have been able to distinguish one sort of fuel from the other, one sort of fossil fuel from the other, and are not imposing blanket bans on fossil fuels. I think that is important for us to create that distinction between the highly polluting fossil fuels and gas.
So have you had the opportunity to discuss this with any of the bankers who are saying that they're not going to support development in Africa, which is the region that's going to have the biggest growth in population?
Well, we are engaging. We are engaging with a few of the institutions. Yes, we are indeed engaging with a few of the DFIs, and we are engaging, and we hope that not only will our arguments make moral sense, we think that the arguments make sound economic sense and also make the most sense in the context of the whole global climate, global climate transition issue. I think that we will be able to convince a lot of these institutions.
So the World Health Organization has actually said indoor air pollution from, as you say, cooking with wood and charcoal is the single biggest environmental problem in the world. And that's very much ties into what you're talking about. Let me pivot a little bit to say that you put a big emphasis, Nigeria puts a big emphasis on developing natural gas. What are the obstacles beyond external finance to expanding your natural gas networks in Nigeria and getting it to more people?
I think that first, and this is probably why we're taking a second look at regulations and investment laws in natural gas. We're taking a second look at that, and we're trying to ensure that we're able to deregulate the downstream sector and deregulate gas investments and gas sales generally, so that this makes more sense for investors. But also, there are, of course, constraints with the distribution facilities for gas, the whole, the infrastructure for gas distribution across the country. And we're trying to invest in that as much as possible so that gas can reach everywhere, and gas can reach homes and all of that. So there are constraints, obviously, also with distribution infrastructure. And those are some of the constraints that we have. Yeah.
Another aspect, of course, you have a petroleum industry bill that I think is coming to approval soon. Obviously, another form of investment is by international energy companies in development. And we're in an era now where it seems those companies are going to be more selective. Do you want to say anything about Nigeria's focus on being competitive as a source of investment for companies?
Yes, that is correct. That's correct. And I think that one of the chief focuses of our petroleum industry bill, which goes to third reading in a couple of days, third reading at the National Assembly, which is the final stage of its becoming law, one of the chief focuses is on trying to make our oil and gas industry much more competitive, especially the gas industry. And I think that one of the chief problems that has arisen is market-based pricing for gas. And I think that most investors would like to see a market-based pricing for gas, especially in the domestic sector, and removal of domestic supply obligations, etc. I mean, there are issues like that people would like to see a difference in. And obviously, people are also looking at sanctity of contract issues. They're looking at some of the deep water provisions that could constrain investments. And there are quite a few of those issues which we hope will be addressed in the PIB. I think that there's no question at all that we just need to be much more competitive, and that's a central issue in the petroleum industry bill. That's definitely a central issue.
So I see that we don't have a lot of time left. I see there's a question from the audience, and then I'll have one last question for you. Question is, how does Nigeria and its partners think about technologies like blue hydrogen or carbon capture in terms of priorities for development and investment? I don't know how much that's in your bailiwick, but if you'd like to say any words on that, that would be welcome.
Well, I'm not entirely certain if much attention has been paid to these technologies, but I think that these will be areas that we'll be very happy to look at. I mean, these certainly will be interesting areas to look at. I don't think at the moment that there is much work that has been done in those areas, but certainly there are areas that we'll be happy to look at.
Right. So, Mr. Vice President, you chair the Economic Sustainability Committee that has been set up to address Nigeria coming out of this terrible pandemic. I think we'd all be grateful and to hear from you about both how Nigeria has coped with COVID, its impact, and your work in terms of plotting an economic course out of this pandemic.
Okay. Thank you again for that. Basically, what we've tried to do with the fallouts of COVID, of course, for us, it meant a sharp drop in oil prices, sharp drop in revenue, and of course, the economic implications of that, especially for an oil and gas dependent economy. I think that certainly affected us. But just to go to how this relates to what we're doing in terms of energy transition, I think that might be the fastest approach to this. We launched, as part of our economic sustainability plan, a flagship project, the 5 million, what we described as the Solar Niger program. This is one where we aim to electrify 5 million households and 25 million people, leveraging solar mini grids and standalone systems. Now, this is important both from the point of view of focusing more on renewables, but also from the point of view of job creation and creating fresh opportunities for and of course this is both a climate change issue for us, an answer to some of the problems that we've experienced, but also one where we hope will address some of the problems around employment and job opportunities. And we think that the potential of off-grid renewables to close the energy deficit in Nigeria and across Africa is critical. And this is why, we've tried to focus on solar energy, especially in response to some of the economic challenges that we found in the wake of COVID-19.
Are you seeing signs of recovery yet? And just how's the health situation?
Yes, we are seeing clear signs of recovery. Fortunately, we haven't. We were not as badly hit as several other parts of the world. I think that in some senses, we would consider ourselves very fortunate, especially with the number of fatalities, the number of deaths. That's extremely low relative to other countries of the world, even the number of infections. But what is also of concern for us, of course, is vaccinations. We are going to be able to do about 2 million vaccinations, and we hope that we'll be able to get some more vaccines. We're making efforts to acquire vaccines, and we're also making efforts to get some from COVAX. We hope that the vaccine nationalism that we're seeing in parts of the world will not affect the supplies to COVAX. Of course, recently, I think it was President Biden who's approved 80 million vaccines for supply to developing countries. I think that would be very helpful, So I think that we are at a point where we can say that with our COVID-19 experience hasn't been certainly nowhere as bad as had been speculated. Cases so far I think are just about 165,000, and deaths a little over 2,000. And we've been able to vaccinate almost 2 million of our people. At least have received the first shot.
Vice President Osinbajo, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. I think you have made a very important contribution for starting this summit and for the global dialogue on climate with the focus on equity, inclusion, and justice, and that the term energy transition has more than one meaning. And I think that's a very important message for the rest of this year as we go to Glasgow. So indeed, thank you and wish you all the best in your efforts and your leadership in Nigeria and on this issue. And on behalf of all of us at the summit, thank you for joining us. As mentioned, the full video recording of this conversation will be available later in the day on the center's website. And just a few messages here. There'll be a brief break before resuming the next session, which will be the Global Agenda in Energy and Development. You can either remain online or for the conversation that will feature Damilola Ogunbiyi, who's the Chief Executive Officer and Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Sustainable Energy for All and co-chair of the UN Energy. And so I think that will be a very good continuation of the conversation that we've had with the Vice President. And again, Mr. Vice President, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be back with everybody in about 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you.